I'm Nyesha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Storytelling Corner. I have a very nice story for you today. And remember, where I'm going to read you the story, and then we're going to go get our parents. And part of this story, I think that parents could even sit down and listen to this story with you. The name of the story is Dave the Potter. He was an artist, a poet, and a slave. And we're going to talk about that a little after I read you the story. And do you know what a slave is? A slave is someone who cannot make decisions for himself. Another person owns him, so he can't do what he wants to do. He has to do what the master tells him to do. And that's what Dave was. Dave was a slave. But he was also an artist, and he was a poet. You know, I love poetry. I didn't used to love poetry. I had to learn how to love poetry. A lot of us have to learn how to love poetry, because I used to think that poets wrote in code, because I never actually knew what they were trying to say. But after I learned, it was wonderful when I learned to love poetry. So we're going to read about Dave the Potter. Get my glasses here. And I want you to really look at the pictures, because Dave kind of tells his own story and how he loves what he does. To us, it is just dirt, the ground we walk on. Scoop up a handful, the gritty grain slip between our fingers. You see how Dave is slipping that sand through his fingers? It just looks like sand to us and dirt, but not to Dave. On wet days, heavy with rainwater, it is cool and squishy, mud pie heaven. But to Dave, it was clay, the plain and basic stuff upon which he learned to form a life as a slave nearly 200 years ago. To us, it is just a pot, round and tall, good for keeping marbles or fresh cut flowers. But to Dave, it was a pot large enough to store a season's grain harvest, to put up salt meat, to hold memories. See that beautiful pot? Each one began out of clouds of dust, clotted clumps of clay, ground in the pug mill and carried wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow to Dave's spinning potter's wheel. With a flat wooden paddle large enough to grow across the Atlantic, Dave mixed clay with water drawn from Big Horse Creek until wet and stiff and heavy. I wanted to bring a big pot of clay today, but got busy and didn't do it. But you could see in the picture the big clump of clay that Dave is working with. He threw He threw the clay, sometimes 60 pounds at once, and nobody knew how or where it would land except for Dave. Dave kicked his potter's wheel until it spun as fast as a carnival's wheel of fortune. Thank you. Oh, see this beautiful, Dave is working with his hands to Dave's hands buried in the molded mud pulled out the shape of a jar, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. He chapped his chapped thumbs, pinched into the center, squeezed the inside against his fingers outside. As the wheel spun round and round, the walls of the jar rose up like a robin's puffed breast, but only so far before its immense weight threatened to collapse. He spun it as big, round and round, and as it get bigger and bigger, almost to collapse, but Dave knew just when to stop it. The jar grew so large, Dave could no longer wrap his strong arms around it. If he climbed into the jar and curled into a ball, it would have been embraced. He would have been embraced. That's how big he could have climbed right in to that big jar. Only then did he stop his potter's wheel and roll long ropes of clay between his dry, caked palms. Dave mounted these coils of clay one by one on the half-finished jar. He ran his wet fingers along the sides to smooth it all together, hitting the wheel with the heel of his foot. There's one of Dave's big jars. The shoulder and rim shrugged upward as the jar took the shape Dave knew was there, even before he worked the raw mount on his wheel. He saw that shape in his head before he even made that jar. While the clay dried, Dave pounded wood, ash, and sand to mix a glass-like brown glaze to withstand the time. A lot of work in making a jar, isn't it? But before the jar completely hardened, Dave picked up a stick and wrote to let us know that he was here. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. That was very dangerous. I'll go back to that page. You can see Dave writing on that big jar. And it says August 16th, 1857. You know, it was against the law for a slave to learn how to write and to read. That must have been something there. Dave must have had a pretty good life as a slave, because he could. How did he learn how to read, and how did he learn how to write? That's something that we're probably never going to know. Let me read you another one of before you asked your parents to really sit down with you, so Miss Cleo could do a little more reading and talking to your parents. They wrote another poem. I'll read you this one. You know, he didn't always spell the words quite right, like some of us, but he still wrote his poems and we can still understand them, even though they may be slightly misspelled. They're still so wonderful. Put every bit all together. Surely this jar will hold 14. So I suppose that jar held about 14 pounds or 14 gallons. And he wrote this in July 12th, 1834, over 100 years ago. Wow. Now we're going to take a little break, and we're going to come right back and give you the second half of our show today. We're going to sit down and talk to your parents. And you too. You can sit and listen too. We'll be right back.
Cases won, money made, or what the firm does in the community. At Dressler Strickland, we know that success is just the beginning. The true measure of success is what you do with it. For 33 years, we've used our success to help our neighbors and our community. 24/7, 11/22. Whenever you need us, we'll be there. Dressler Strickland, building communities one case at a time.
The folks at Cull Books in Hartford want to remind parents, kids need to exercise the most important muscle in their body, the brain. How do you do that? Read. What happens? Well, let me tell you. The imagination soars, the creativity blossoms, the world opens up, and the need to be entertained by outside forces diminishes. Don't believe me? Try it. You won't be sorry. And in time, either will your kids. Cull Book cares about your child's literacy. Join Miss Cleo every week on Miss Cleo's Storytelling Corner online at accesstv.org.
Hi, and welcome to accesstv.org. I'm your host from Shaping the Next Generation, Naima Jackson. Welcome to accesstv.org. We're your hosts, Naima Jackson.
And I'm Elijah Williams.
Thank you for tuning in to Shaping the Next Generation. Today's special guest is Ms. Vicki Gallen-Clark.
Ms. Vicki will stop by on the show to talk about her role in the Blue Hill Civic.
Now, if you haven't heard about Blue Hill Civic Association, you should definitely look into it. It's located on Asylum. Now, if you don't know anything about Blue Hills, you should know that Blue Hill Civic Association, they will definitely help you get a step forward in your future. They'll help you figure out what you want to be in the future, because they definitely helped me. I figured out what I want my career to be. I figured out what college I want to go to, and I figured out what I want to major in. Blue Hills helped me because they helped me learn how to write a resume, a cover letter. They prepared me for an interview to get a job. Blue Hill Civic Association is definitely the perfect program for our youth today. Now, thank you for joining us on accesstv.org. I like accesstv.org because they offer us highlights on our local community that you don't get from Channel 3 or Fox News. They also gave us highlights from sports like track and field. So thank you so much for joining us. And all the youth out there, you should definitely join us at Access TV and definitely check out Blue Hill Civic Association, because it will help you, it will motivate you to get out there, look into our programs, and it will help you shape your future.
Welcome, parents, to Miss Cleo's Storytelling Corner. I hope your children had run and gotten you and told you about the story that I have just told them. And maybe you sat down and listened to that story too. The reason I chose this story is because It was about one of our forefathers, Dave the Potter, and he had wonderful talent, natural talent that nobody taught him. He just had that in him, and he was a slave, and I wanted to talk about that also with you, and just to tell you a little bit more about. Well, let me talk about, kind of mixing my words here, but he was a artist, a poet, a slave. We learn so many things just naturally. And when it comes to that slavery, it's so important that our children know about that, and that they learn about it from our parents, because there's a certain way you have to introduce that, and hopefully at a young age, and not when you're older and you get furious about the whole thing, but to learn about how wonderful these people were that came over from across the water, that everything was taken from them, their language, their culture, but their heart, their instincts, they were still there. And all the wonderful things that they brought to America. Our children need to know about that. So I'm going to read you a little bit more about Dave. Dave is an important American artist. His beautifully crafted jar stand out among the pottery of the time. His whimsical poems embody a simplicity and deep emotional complexity that revel the Japanese haiku. And Japanese haiku, that's a short poem. And I don't know how to exactly explain it, but it's about syllables, and about 7 syllables, and it's a complicated, very short poem. These are remarkable accomplishments in themselves, but for Dave, who lived most of his life as a slave, they are even more incredible. We have printed his poems here as they appear on the pots. And it says that he makes some mistakes, but he wrote them down and we can understand them, and they're important. We know about Dave mainly because of what he wrote on his pottery. For long periods of time, Dave did not write on the sides of his pots, perhaps because he knew it was not safe. He would sometimes just sign his name. He only had a first name because slaves were not allowed to have family names like Hill or Collier, and those are the last names of our authors. No, I think that that's a nice point to point out to your children, that at one time we were not allowed to have last names, and explain to them just how we got our names. And if you need to look up how we got our last names and that we only had one name, I know that a lot of parents haven't looked into the lives of slaves, our forefathers, but our children need to know. We need to know our history. I've heard a lot of times when I bring up something about this, someone will say, that happened a long time ago. Let me tell you, nobody throws away their history. Nobody throws away, no culture throws away their history or their foreparents, not even us. So let us learn about who our foreparents were, what they did, their accomplishments, and who we are because of them and what we have. I'm going to read you a little bit more about Dave's poems. Now, here's a poem that Dave wrote. It says, Dave belongs to Mr. Miles, where the ovens bake, and the pot biles. Now, what do you think? Maybe I think he's saying, now I don't know, maybe you would think something else, but I think Dave is saying, day belongs to Mr. Miles, where the ovens bakes and the pots boil. Boil. That's what I think. July 31st, 1840. Some of what we know about Dave is buried in the shadows of the lives of his owners. The first record of Dave dates to his 17th year. His name appears on a contract to borrow money to buy a house. Because his age is mentioned, we know that he was born sometime around 1801. We also learn that he was born in the United States, but we don't know where. Another poem. A better thing I never saw when I shot off the lion's jaw. November 9th, 1836. We can suppose that Dave lived a life much better than that of most slaves who worked in the fields. As a potter, he had a skill few Black people were allowed to learn. Slaves were generally used for unskilled jobs. White slave owners feared that if their slaves learned skills such as blacksmithing or pottery, they might demand freedom and respect. For the same reason, slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. How Dave learned may never be known. Wow. Another poem. Another trick is worse than this. Dearest Miss, spare me a kiss. August 26, 1840. You may think that these are little things and that, these are little things and don't mean much. But can you imagine that Dave risked his life in writing these? Sometimes the punishment for learning how to read and write were very severe. So this is a very courageous man who not only had imagination, creativity, but had the courage to do what he needed to do, to learn to read. His heart must have been filled. You realize now we don't think that much of it, but there was a time when we wanted to read more than anything. And the first thing, actually, I think that we learned how to read out of was the Bible. And we wanted to do that. And a lot of us were severely punished for learning how to read. So it's so different today, isn't it? When a lot of us don't think that much of it. But it is still so very, very important. According to Leonard Todd Davis, well, let me start that again. According to Leonard Todd, Dave lost his leg when he was around 35 years old. After that, his friend Henry, whose arm was crippled, kicked the potter's wheel for him. The details of the story in this book are taken from Dave's life before and after he lost his leg. So we don't talk too much about that in here. But imagine he lost his leg and his friend kicked that potter's wheel for him and he kept on going. When you need to keep on going, you find a way. Dave found a way to keep on going and keep on making his pots and kept on writing his poetry with the help of a friend. He kept on doing what he was meant to do. That's why I think this story is a wonderful story. It's about a person who had a talent, and it didn't matter whether he was a slave or not. He kept on. We need to do the same today. When we think of our forefathers and think that they kept on, we need to keep on too. And we need to learn more about them. And we need to learn more about people like Dave, who kept on. Even though it was a dangerous thing to do, he did what was in his heart to do. So talk to your children about keeping on. Talk to your children about our forefathers and about their natural talents. Look into their natural talents. Look into your natural talents. Well, that's about all I have to say today. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you remember Dave and our forefathers who came across that water to give us the gifts we have today. So I will see you next week. Please come back and visit me, and I'll have another story for you. And maybe a guest too, who knows? Who knows what Miss Cleo is going to do? So you remember, read a little, write a little, dream big, and I'll see you next week.